Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Would you like to paint this with me? I would love it if you'd follow along. In the next video, we'll be painting this tutorial, but first we have to go over some basics. And Chip says hi. What we're going to talk about in this episode is paint consistency. Paint consistency with watercolor pretty much has everything to do with the entire process, with how transparent the particular paint is you're using, with how your washes will lay onto the paper, with how the paint will mix with other paint on the paper. So that's what I'm doing here, is just laying out a bit of flat wash so that once it dries it can be a demo piece. But I want to introduce you to a concept that I learned from one of my favorite watercolor artists, Nitin Singh. He has his own channel. I'll put the name up there. But the concept I picked up from him was water, milk, and butter. So when you're trying to work out consistency of watercolor paint, imagine the paint that you put in the tray as having the consistency of either water, milk, or butter. So water, obviously, very runny, it's going to be loose, it's going to move around, and that's what you see being demoed right here. The benefit of very watery mixtures is it's, one, very transparent. So you're going to be able to see basically the layer behind it. It's also really good for glazing. So putting one light layer of color over another layer. So we're going to move on to the milk. So we're just grabbing a little bit more paint from the pan, adding it to what I already have out, and I'm just kind of checking it. I want to mix it with a little bit of water, but not too much. So I still want it to be considerably thicker than the first. When we move on to the butter, you could kind of call that straight out of the tube if you were using tube paint. In this case, I'm going to be using the pan, so I don't use any water. I just dip it right in the pan, straight onto the paper. So you can already see that it's a lot more opaque. It's covering up the paper a lot more. It also looks warmer. So it's the same red, but it has a deeper, more vibrant, and also warmer look than the thinner mixture. So understanding your consistency is also going to mean understanding that you're going to get different colors and temperatures out of the same paint, possibly. And what I'm doing on the edge is just showing you kind of what edge control you're going to have with different mixtures. So edge control and consistency is really, I don't know, making up a random percentage, like 85% of watercolor. Having a good understanding of value, and you're a painter. You're there. See, now the thicker the mixture, the more you can draw out the paint that's left on the paper and create kind of that gradient. Certain pigments, this one in particular seems to, I don't know, it might be a little bit staining, but it really doesn't come into a nice perfect gradient. So that's another thing that you can kind of end up practicing to understand the consistency. Is some paints are really nice about blending and moving around once they've been laid out on the paper. This particular red is maybe not so much, but that's fine, and it depends. It does affect how you're going to end up using a color in a particular application in a painting you're working on. So it's good to know the limits and expectations you can have of the paint. This is where we're mixing up the thickest layer. So like I said, there's just enough water in the brush to get the paint to move, but it's basically dipped straight in the pan, no water added. or at least as little as possible. When you're using liquid paint or paint from the tube, you can use straight from the tube. That kind of glisten is not paint that's missing on the paper. It is just that thick and that reflective of light. So that is very, very thick red paint. You can see the difference. It's entirely opaque. You're not looking at the paper through that paint. And it might even be warmer than the middle consistency there. And it's taking a lot of water to draw that out, to change that edge. All of this is going in a direction. So the reason this is going to be important is going to be, and you'll see in the demo that's coming up just after the red squares, is understanding your paint consistency as well as how wet the paper is already is entirely going to go towards creating edges within the painting. So edges of color or value or what have you. Because you're using a water-based paint and because the paper may already be wet or dry, you're going to create different layers for one, and two, different edges between those layers. So one of the biggest things you want to be able to control for is understanding whether or not you want a particular edge to be soft or hard, or broken, or whatever. But so I laid down that yellowish square so that it would dry nearly completely. It's pretty much all the way dry. It's dry enough for this demonstration to show that I'm taking at first a somewhat medium, mostly water, maybe a little bit thicker than just water, and going right over that dry section of yellow. And as you can see, the line is pretty hard. It's not blending much into the yellow square. Now I'm adding another thinner layer, so definitely water, right next to the first red square. And what's happening is, because I just put two shapes next to each other, both wet and touching each other, and because there's a difference between their consistency. So in other words, one is a little bit more densely packed with paint than the other. The paints are going to move in between each other just a little bit along that boundary. It's just like science class, right? Diffusion. Something of a high concentration in a watery mix wants to move from the high to the low. So where you have wet paint meeting wet paint, there's going to be some movement of that paint across the layer you're mixing. Now, moving to the other side, I went as dark as possible. So that's going to be as hard of a line as you can possibly get. It's not mixing with anything because that paint is so thick. There's really not water in it that wants to try and move into the dry paper. So if you were going to add a very wet mix, even on the dry paper there, you're going to find that paint can go into the paper and try to move a little bit. But that's another part of understanding that consistency. If it's going onto dry paper, you're using a real thick paint, you can trust that it's not going to move too far. Whereas if you look back at that middle square, that was a very wet mix, and it did soak into the paper and diffuse that edge a little bit. So you can see a thinner mix applied pretty heavily. It did end up getting a nice soft edge there, softer than the first square for sure, even though that square was quite dry. So something to pay attention to. So if in the first one I showed you the effects of the three different consistencies on a dry layer of paint, now I am going to mix up a nice background and show you what the consistencies do on a, I would call it damp background. I'm not going to leave it totally saturated because normally even wet and wet, you're not going to like shoot a bunch of color into a completely soaking wet thing, unless you're going to mix colors directly on the page, which is totally legitimate, but not what I'm trying to demonstrate here. See, here you can see where I was talking about that nice soft edge. That was the very watery mixture going onto a dry background. And it did a nice job of softening up and kind of fading into the distance. It's a good technique to pay attention to when you want to paint like houses, things in the distance, anything you want to not necessarily stand out. So I am mixing a medium-ish, somewhere between water and milk, just like the first one. And it's going into a damp background. So I've given it a little time for that watery layer to kind of soak into the paper. So it's not dry, but it's also not just water sitting on top of the paper. And you can see that's the same mixture consistency as in the first example. And already that edge, even on the medium paint, is diffusing a little bit. And then what you can see is the more watery mixture that I added next to it, just like in the first example, but now on the wet background. Granted, I made that background a little bit darker, but because it's so watery, it actually created a weird little area where it's going into the paper and pushing paint out of its way. So that can be something you might want to have happen in a painting, but it can also be a mistake or something that you don't plan on happening. Things like that can end up drying with really funny... Basically, the water goes into the paper. It pushes the pigment around that's already there and creates a funny line. Just like if you imagine when salt is drying, you end up with crystals. Well, kind of the same thing happens here. The water dries, and it dries in an interesting geometric pattern. Sometimes you can use that in a painting, but a lot of the time it just looks goofy. It looks like an edge that dried funny, like when you spill coffee on paper or a napkin or something. Now, when that happens, if you catch it in time, you can stop that. I think it's called blossoming or blooming. You can take a clean brush and run it along the edge, and I think I do that here at some point. But you can take a clean brush and just go ahead and gently manipulate that edge to get it to look kind of how you want, and you can stop that. Kind of, if it's a negative effect, you can stop that and make it look kind of more how you want. So comparing those two, you can see the really thick, on the right, the really thick red paint kept a hard line. The same consistency on the left. It did soften in just a little bit, but you can see how the thicker the paint compared to the thickness of the paint that it's going onto matters a great deal. So because it's so thick, even though that background on the left is damp, it still doesn't want to move that much. Whereas the waterier paint, even on the left, that went crazy. It cleaned out all the paint that was on the background already. Here we're just demonstrating adding water onto a dry surface versus the wetter surface. So a damp surface where that paint hasn't completely set in on the left. And so adding a little bit of water can really quickly go into the paper and displace the paint that's already there, making it easy to pick up. So another good technique for when you want to paint something, you see either a mistake or it's your intention to have a nice smooth background and then add a lighter shape into it. Once it's still wet, if it's still wet, you can go in and pull it out and kind of do some negative painting. Here I'm going to do a quick demonstration just to show some more of the effects of this real quick. And this is kind of the coolest thing. You're going to see kind of the same swatch of water applied to the surface, but the paint's going to do very cool different things within the same dampness of paper. So just like I talked about the consistency of the paint and high versus low concentration of water, we're going to start with a very watery mix going into damp paper. And you're going to see what it's going to want to do versus what the thicker paint mixture is going to want to do within the same concentration of dampness of paper. It's actually really cool. The damp background with a watery paint, it wants to run a lot. It wants to move around because there's no paint in that water. That necessarily means that the paint concentration is higher in even the watery mix that you're adding on top. So several things happen. The water on the paper wants to pull the paint into it. It wants it to be even, and it wants to diffuse it throughout the mixture that's there. Also, the paint is going to flow from the brush. So if the paper is damp and you have a fair bit of water in your brush, the longer you leave the brush in contact with the paper, the more it's going to kind of suck the paint right out of the brush onto the paper. It's a pretty cool technique, and something to also keep in mind when you're trying to make a particular shape or movement. The time that you have the brush in contact with the paper will affect how much paint comes out and where it goes. Something to pay attention to for sure. Now for the thicker paint. So I was trying to demonstrate how you could let the paint flow right from the brush, have the water on the paper pull it, but it is thick enough, even though that background is damp, that you can really still just place the paint in one spot. And as it dries, it'll get a little bit softer around the edge, but it's definitely not flowing quickly into the paper like the more watery mixture did on the right there. Great technique to pay attention to. Mostly this is all coming down to understanding what consistency is already on the paper, what consistency you're mixing, and that's going to help you understand how to achieve a particular effect that you're trying to achieve. What I found coolest about this particular demonstration here is the right and the left side are essentially completely opposite in how they reacted. I pointed out here in a second, but on the right, where it was a watery mixture, there were little blossoms, little blooms that happened at the top, where I put a bit of paint and then it kind of dried out. It didn't get to flow into the surrounding area so much. So there's cool little flower blossoms there. At the top of the left, it didn't do that so much. It did it down at the bottom where there was somewhat of a large pool of paint that then spent time drying into the back of the paint, or into the background. So it's actually kind of cool. Okay, so the takeaways from this example, this demonstration, are that 3 different consistencies of paint. It's easiest to just understand and stick to water, milk, butter. Then mixing paint on the paper is going to give you the most consistent reaction, we'll call it. That's going to go towards basically, imagine if you're going to make a painting, have kind of a 1-step, 2-step, 3-step plan in mind. First step, go nice and light with the water mixture. Second step, go onto a medium mixture where you're going to be making a little bit more of an opaque layer to apply over the top of the previous layer once it's dry. Third, go with that darkest, get the most vibrant, the most opaque. This is where your shadows are going to be, your details, things like that. And it sets you up to have a painting where it's planned out, it's organized, and you're going to get the best use of all of the different opacities and transparencies of watercolor, as well as keep you from overworking a particular area. And lastly, edge control. All of this consistency completely sets up your edge control. If you want a soft edge, a hard edge, a broken edge, you're going to want to understand what you've got on the brush, understand where the background is at, and then adjust either or both to get a particular reaction. So that's all I got. Thanks for watching. Any questions, leave them in the comments. I will answer them. And follow the next video for that tutorial I showed in the beginning. That's what we're going to paint. And we're going to try and use all of the skills that we've taught so far in these videos. Thank you. And now, a word from our sponsor.